giving you food for thought, if nothing else, on the situation with Crimea and the response of the West. Former presidential candidate Ron Paul, also former congressman, wrote an editorial for the USA Today. I'm actually going to read you a couple paragraphs because it's good. And it echoed some of the thoughts that I've expressed on this program, or I echoed his, whichever came first. But I again want to point something out. Venice wants to break away from Italy with a vote. The Italian federal government doesn't want that. Scotland wants to leave Great Britain. The English don't want that. Quebec wants to leave Canada. The Canadian government doesn't want that. And yet, we're not up in arms when they want to do what they're doing, but when Crimea says we want to leave Ukraine, we scream it's a violation of international law. I've repeatedly asked the question on this program, what law? I want to read to you what Ron Paul said about some of these things. He said, what's the big deal? Opponents of the Crimea vote like to point to the illegality of the referendum, but self-determination is a centerpiece of international law. Article 1 of the United Nations Charter points out clearly that the purpose of the UN is to, quote, develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. So when the UN recognized Kosovo after the breakup of Yugoslavia, this is what they referred to. And there was a lot of bloodshed there. You have to remember Serbia and U.S. involvement and NATO involvement. It was bad. I continue. Why does the U.S. care which flag will be hoisted on a small piece of land thousands of miles away? Critics point to the Russian occupation of Crimea as evidence that no fair vote could have taken place. Where were these people when an election held in an Iraq occupied by U.S. troops was called a triumph of democracy? That's some serious irony. Perhaps the U.S. officials who supported the unconstitutional overthrow of Ukraine's government should refocus their energies on learning our own constitution, which does not allow the U.S. government to overthrow governments overseas or send $1 billion to bail out Ukraine and its international creditors. From Ron Paul, something he wrote for the USA Today. Let me point out a couple of things. Number one, I think that as this really begins to shake down, Russia is clearly going to keep Crimea. The end. And sadly, there have been 2 lives lost as of this taping, but thankfully, for the most part, the removal of Ukrainian troops, the seizure of various bases has happened with goodwill and without bloodshed. And I've been watching the film clips. I think what this is about largely has to do with NATO's obligations to new member states. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which was designed and created to stand against Russia, well, they obligated us to protect Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, okay? The Baltic states. And you see that map, and you see they border Russia, and this happened at a time when Russia was fairly weak after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the allies of NATO welcomed these states into NATO, thereby obligating NATO to use military force should any of these member states be threatened by Russia. Because that is the principle of NATO. An attack on one member of NATO results in a counterattack from all members of NATO. So I think that when these nations were received into NATO, no one thought that Russia would have a rebound in their 1,000-year-old concept of greatness, of empire. And it's to our discredit that we don't know history. Our empire, and let's face it, we do have an empire, only goes back to the end of World War II. The British Empire was for hundreds of years. Russia had an empire for hundreds of years. China had an empire for hundreds of years. And these other nations, China and Russia specifically, they are not content to live in a world where U.S. foreign policy drives the agenda for everyone. I'll read to you some of the quotes from Putin's speech and have a comment or two on that in his perspective and the failure of American media. It really is upsetting to me. This is the voice of resistance.